Hey everyone, welcome back to Toast and Topics. It's been quite a while since we've put out an episode, but don't worry, both Ben and I haven't forgotten about the podcast. The honest answer is that things have been pretty busy for the both of us recently. Ben has been getting settled into his new graduate school life on the West Coast, and I've been adjusting to a new apartment as of a few months ago. But we are back and better than ever with an amazing interview coming your way.
That's right. It's good to be back, Sachin. And we're really so lucky to have Eddie Fishman on today's show. For background, Eddie is currently a senior fellow and director of the Maurice R. Greenberg Center for Geoeconomic Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, where he focuses on the intersection of geopolitics, technology, and economics. He is also a senior research scholar at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy and an adjunct professor of international and public affairs there. Eddie has had quite an illustrious career, serving in a number of foreign policy roles across the U.S. government, including as an advisor to Secretary John Kerry on Europe, as a lead in the State Department's Office of Economic Sanctions Policy, where he worked on key issues in Russia-Ukraine, as well as serving as a member of the Iran sanctions team, where he developed policies to strengthen the implementation of sanctions and maintain pressure on Iran through international negotiations. Eddie is also the author of a New York Times bestseller called Chokepoints: American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, which focuses on the influence that the U.S. has exerted on other countries through economic leverage over key nodes, which have become more digital and strategic in nature over time. Okay, Eddie, we'll get into the meat of your book later in the episode, but I wanted to start with what's going on in the world right now. Toward the start of Choke Points, you described a striking scene: a Treasury Department official named Stuart Levy walking into the boardrooms of some of the biggest banks in the world, carrying classified intelligence on Iranian financial transactions. And with the backing of the US government, he managed to convince a large number of banks to stop dealing with Iran. And the results of that ultimately were staggering. Iran's oil sales dropped precipitously, and the pressure that we put on Iran at that time ultimately led to the Iran nuclear deal and a period of stability with that country. But let's fast forward to today. We're in the midst of a major conflict against Iran, which has been isolated from the world economy now for decades as a result of our sanctions. And ultimately, those sanctions were not enough to prevent a war. American economic warfare was in many ways born out of the Iran sanctions. And so I'm curious about how you are reflecting on our use of sanctions now that our conflict with Iran has escalated from an economic one to a kinetic one.
Well, in many ways, the rise of sanctions in American foreign policy in the early 21st century was driven by the view that we didn't want to fight more kinetic wars. To go back to that period when Stuart Levy walked into the boardrooms of those banks in 2006, 2007, the US was fighting two wars in the Middle East. We're bogged down in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Neither war was going particularly well. And so even though Iran was the topmost national security threat facing the United States at the time, they were building an industrial scale nuclear capability. They were actively funding terrorist groups like Hezbollah and Hamas. And there were concerns that even if Iran wasn't going to develop an ICBM, nuclear warhead with that could hit the United States, that they could potentially provide fissile material to Hezbollah, and you could
Mm-hmm.
have a nuclear 9/11 on our hands. So this was really at the very top of the priority list when it came to U.S. national security. Yet we weren't willing to try to launch a regime change war against Iran because we had seen how those went. And so the whole motivation for this sanctions campaign, the reason that Stuart Levy innovated and created a whole new toolkit for economic warfare was because we thought military war wasn't the solution. And so, in effect, if you're just asking sort of for me to reflect, there's an
Yeah.
element of tragedy here because I think that in some ways we succeeded at the goal that Levy set out to do, which was to use economic pressure to constrain Iran's nuclear program. The reason that we got into this place was that I think we then pivoted our goals. We started moving from not just constraining Iran's nuclear program, but really trying to change the fundamental nature of the Iranian regime. And I think maximalist objectives are almost never accomplishable by limited tools like sanctions.
Yeah. Fascinating.
That's really interesting. And let's just maybe take a step back and return to the basics of American economic warfare. I mean, can you just tell us and the audience a little bit more broadly about the key arguments that you make in your book, Choke Points? Because you're describing a fundamentally different kind of power than what we usually think of in international relations, at least in the traditional sense.
Totally. Look, I mean, economic pressure has always been a way that countries seek to achieve their goals around the world. Going back to ancient Greece, you have the first use of sanctions that we know of in 432 BC, when the Athenians imposed a trade embargo on Megara. Napoleon in the early 19th century did a trade embargo on Britain called the Continental System, and we had various embargoes imposed throughout the 20th century. I think to illustrate why what I call the age of economic warfare, which really dates from that, Stuart Levy's beginning of the campaign against Iran in the mid-aughts to the present, is to look at what economic warfare looked right before that. So in the 1990s.
Hmm.
And I don't know how old you guys are. You might not remember this, but in August of 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and annexed it. And within 72 hours, the UN imposed a full-scale embargo on Iraq. And the intention of that embargo was to stop Iraq from selling oil on the global marketplace. The way that the UN implemented it for 13 years, all the way from 1990 to 2003, was through a multinational naval blockade. So ships from over 20 countries, commanded by a US naval admiral, patrolled the Persian Gulf day and night, inspecting every single oil tanker coming in and out of an Iraqi port. They would actually send commandos on helicopters or speedboats to board the tankers and sometimes take samples of oil to send to labs for testing. The reason I bring this up is as recently as the 1990s, when you wanted to stop a country like Iraq from selling oil, you actually had to use military force. It was the
Hmm.
Pentagon that was commanding this embargo. It wasn't the Treasury Department or the State Department. It wasn't civilians. And that's what's true of all the big examples of economic warfare throughout history. It was usually naval powers that were doing it because they were using their naval dominance to interdict trade. Or you would, if it wasn't a naval power, you'd use sieges, right? Where you surround a city and say, thou shalt not pass. What happened
Yeah.
in the 1990s is we also have hyperglobalization. It's when Russia, China enter the global economy. They start using the dollar for their cross-border transactions. They integrate themselves into transnational supply chains. And so you have the creation of these invisible choke points, these parts of the global economy where one country has a dominant position and there are few, if any, substitutes. The dollar is kind of the classic example. And by virtue of weaponizing these choke points, like the dollar in the US case or rare earth minerals in China's case, countries today can impose hard hitting economic pressure on their rivals without deploying any military force. And so I think the way I would summarize it is in the age of economic warfare over the last 2 decades, the political cost of using economic warfare has gone way down because you no longer have to deploy the military, whereas the impact has simultaneously gone up. And so, similar to the way air power revolutionized military force by allowing you to drop bombs on someone else's cities without putting your troops in harm's way, and drones even more so, that's kind of what we have today with the types of sanctions that are used.
Yeah, that's a great overview of both how the US is able to use these sanctions and where a lot of this economic leverage is actually derived from. I'm glad you mentioned China's rare earths export controls. I think it's a great example of an adversary starting to use choke points to its own advantage. I think Iran's attacks on the Strait of Hormuz are, in some ways, another example of that, though using methods certainly that are a bit less sophisticated than what the Treasury Department was doing to Iran in the aughts. And so I would like you to reflect a bit on that. How do the choke points that the U.S. and its allies have compare to those that its adversaries have? And should we expect that, A, the choke points that we have available to us are going to start eroding as we use them more? And B, should we expect that our adversaries are going to get a bit smarter about using the choke points at their own disposal? What's the picture of leverage going to be in the future?
So, look, if I weren't a guest on your podcast, I would turn the tables around and ask you this question because you've written as intelligently on this as anyone else. And I'll say there's an active debate right now. And maybe I'll back up and say we don't really know, right? We don't know whether US choke points or Chinese choke points are more potent. And there's, I think, smart people on both sides. On one side, on sort of the China choke points are more potent. You've got people like Adam Posen, the head of the Peterson Institute. On the US choke point side, you've got Ben Vagel, the host of this podcast. But I will say, just to give you a little bit of a boost, you also have me on your side. I tend to believe that when you're just looking at pure economic potency, I would rather be in the position of the United States than China. And really, I mean, maybe the way to look at it, and I don't know how technical you want to get. I actually
Yeah,
have a framework for how you define a choke point. There are three things you need. One, you need
love
a
it.
dominant concentrated market share. Two, You need something that's really hard to substitute. Ideally, it has to take years for you to be able to substitute it. And three, you have to be able to weaponize that position with asymmetric effects. So you're imposing
Yep.
more pain on the adversary than you have on yourself. Rare earths for China clearly meets all of those criteria. The dollar for the U.S. clearly meets all of those criteria. NVIDIA chips, NVIDIA designed GPUs clearly meet those criteria. I think that the reason I'd rather be the U.S. is on the substitutability side. Rare earths processing is capital intensive and environmentally destructive, but it's not technologically insurmountable. I would bet on the US being able to stand up an alternative supply chain to rare earths before China can completely replicate the dollar financial system or create an alternative to the best in class AI chips that are designed by NVIDIA with tooling from ASML and fabricated by TSMC. I think to the extent
Yep.
that the best argument may be in favor of China's choke points really isn't about potency, it's about political will. It's does China potentially, even if they have got a weaker hand, do they have the ability to play a high stakes game of poker with us longer just because they've got a tougher nerve? And I think that might be possible, right? I mean, I think we've seen that the Achilles heel of American economic warfare is that our presidents don't have a particularly high appetite for even
Totally.
small spikes in oil prices or dips in the stock market. So I think that to the extent if we actually were to go toe to toe with China, God forbid, in a rapidly escalating economic conflict, that would be sort of China's best case for winning would be to sort of exhaust our political will sooner than we exhaust theirs.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to that. And in that vein, I've been struck by the recent announcement that we're going to be loosening sanctions on Russian oil in order to start to control the price of that commodity in response to Iran's attacks on the Strait of Hormuz. What's your read on that?
It's tragic. I
Yeah.
mean, because look, the price spike we have right now is obviously completely of our own making. The U.S. Entered this military conflict with Iran underestimating Iran's will and capability to keep the strait closed. What they've showed is, I mean, they clearly have the will to do so. They're fighting a war that they believe is existential. Both the U.S. and Israel seek to eliminate the Islamic Republic of Iran. And then in terms of capabilities, the capabilities it takes to close the strait are really quite inexpensive and really hard to eliminate, right? It's not like they're using sophisticated anti-ship missiles. They're using drones, speedboats laced with explosives, sea mines, very, very low cost, low tech, types of kit that I think even with a really prolonged air campaign against Iran, you'll never be able to completely destroy. So my own
Yeah.
assessment of the situation is that we cannot forcibly open the strait absent a ground invasion of Iran. So I think that's really the predicament the Trump administration has itself in right now. Either it can back down and say, we bit off more than we can chew. We're trying to end this, and then hope that the Iranians are willing to reopen the strait in exchange for a ceasefire. I think they may ask for more than that, or to escalate,
Yeah.
probably put boots on the ground, or at least put ourselves on some sort of a slippery slope to having that very soon.
Yeah, it's a tricky dynamic. And I think the one thing that we really do have going for us with the Strait of Hormuz is that Iran is not only hurting us and closing it off, it's hurting basically every other country on earth, including China. It's an incredibly blunt choke point. And so if we were to relent, I wonder if they actually would be able to, keep up the pressure on the strait, or if they eventually would be forced, not just by the US, but by the entire international community to stop turning the screws there.
Well, it's
We'll have
interesting.
to
I think
see.
The
Yeah.
Iranians right now, I mean, one thing I find really fascinating is they're trying to selectively open the strait, right? To say, well, maybe we'll allow Indian tankers through, or maybe we'll
Uh,
allow French tankers through. I mean, if they
Yeah.
can accomplish that, kudos to them, right? I mean, that's like, having that level of power of the global oil market would be quite impressive. But look, I mean, I do think that the US is not in a great position right now. I think China is much better insulated from this kind of a shock. They've got the world's biggest stockpile of oil.
Hmm.
And they're also much further ahead in terms of reducing their dependency on oil and having a legitimate
Yes.
green energy sector, right, that they dominate. I mean, in a sense,
Yep.
if I'm China right now, I see this as a huge opportunity because it's signaling two things at once. Once, on the one hand, it's signaling that the U.S. is completely reckless, unreliable, liable to start wars that it can't finish, spiking global oil prices to everyone. On the other side, it's showing the world that dependence on fossil fuels is really dangerous. And to the extent the world this accelerates the transition to clean technology, which I think it will, that's going to give China a huge
Oh yeah,
amount of leverage over everybody else in the world.
yeah. Their bet on green energy certainly seems to be paying off in that sense. And honestly, I think that a lot of that was instigated 20 years ago as a result of their concerns over, their reliance on oil from the Strait of Hormuz, for example. So,
Yeah.
yeah, this does seem to have worked out for them pretty well. I like the framework that you have for, determining the severity of a choke point, so to speak. One area that I've been thinking a lot about, kind of in that vein, is the importance of firms, multinational corporations who actually are producing, the goods that could ultimately become choke points, and essentially, how they interact with state power, and whether it's important to actually have, firms that belong to, a given country in order for that country to be able to like weaponize the goods that it's producing. Like, should we be worried about iPhones being made in China, for example, when it's Apple that ultimately is controlling a lot of the supply chains? I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that.
Look, I mean, I think one of the things that makes economic warfare so difficult to analyze as a strategist is that governments set policies, but firms are on the front lines. They're the ones implementing all of these policies. And, it's not typically the government who's, adjusting supply chains. They're putting out regulations and then hoping that businesses show more flexibility. I think a big reason, sort of an overlay of the narrative I gave you earlier on sort of the rise of economic warfare and sort of a government reaction to the perceived failures of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, part of the story of the increasing potency of U.S. sanctions was about bringing banks to heel, basically making the banks realize that if they were to violate sanctions, it would potentially be existential for them as a corporate entity. And
Hmm.
so they went from, in the early 2000s, most of the banks doing all kinds of sanctions violations and not worrying about it, thinking that worst comes to worst, they'd get a slap on the wrist, to having multiple thousands of people working on sanctions compliance,
Yep.
having banks around the world fine $10 billion, for violating sanctions. I mean, I think that the financial sector has been brought to heel and effectively does implement the dictates of the US government. But that same process hasn't played across other industries. And I think in some ways you can read US export controls on China from 2019 to the present as sort of this tussle about, can we get the tech companies to sort of do our bidding the same way that
Yep.
Wall Street has. And I would argue that Jensen Huang's ability to persuade the Trump administration to allow him to sell relatively advanced semiconductors to China represents basically the failure of that attempt. It represents sort of the tech companies showing that they can't be muscled the way that the banks were. And so I think right now it
Yeah.
is, to your point, I think firms, especially in the tech industry, have a really significant role to play because they don't simply listen to the US government.
Right. And do you think that's a systemic limitation, or is that just a function of the Trump administration's approach to economic statecraft?
I think that it's not a systemic limitation. I do think it's possible for government and the tech sector to work collaboratively in the name of US national security. I don't think that's what's happening right now. I think the tech community has tried to hijack the concept of national security to get the US government to do what they think is worth it. I mean, the Nvidia case to me is pretty egregious. If you just think about it,
Yeah,
Nvidia is a $5 trillion company. They're not hurting for
totally.
demand for their chips. And so just selling chips to China doesn't mean that they're all of a sudden going to make a lot more money. It means that, chips that previously would have gone to US companies or to allied companies are going to wind up going to China. They're not hurting for demand. And so, yes, it will bid up the price of their chips, but yeah, it's to me a very clear-cut case that it's good for Nvidia and quite bad for US national security.
Yeah, I totally agree with this. And one of the really tough parts of that entire dynamic is that you can have people like Jensen say, oh, well, the Chinese are right behind us based off of, X, Y, or Z breakthrough that Huawei claims that it's made. But after that, there's never really any validation that those breakthroughs are scalable, right? Like, sure, maybe it's able to, as a prototype, build a really advanced semiconductor, but what's the failure rate of that, right? Like yeah,
To me, I mean,
it's
the
just
data is,
tricky. Yeah,
NVIDIA controls 85% of the global AI accelerator market. And the closest rival is AMD. The other companies are all US companies. Huawei is not
yeah,
even on the list. I think it's like
yeah,
1%. Right.
right.
So, I mean, you'd have to just show me show me the Huawei chips that are being used to train best in class large language models. I haven't seen
Totally.
them.
Yeah, I like that rubric.
Yeah.
One thing that I found interesting, Eddie, is that in your work you laid out what you call the geo-economic trilemma, essentially the idea that states can't simultaneously have deep economic interdependence, national security from an economic perspective, and geopolitical competition. Essentially, you have to sacrifice one of those three. I'm wondering if the U.S. continues to prioritize competition, which seems to be a fairly bipartisan consensus. What specific sacrifices should we be preparing for, and what are the kind of next dominoes to fall?
Yeah. Thanks for asking me this, Sachin, just because, most of Chokepoints, my book, is a contemporary narrative history, which I think is important because I don't think if you don't understand how events have unfolded over the last 25 years plus, you have no hope to sort of assess what's happening today. But I did want to leave readers with a little bit of take home value. And so I'm glad that the geoeconomic impossible trinity has caught on. These three criteria or these three factors, economic security, economic interdependence, and geopolitical competition, just to give a quick rundown. So during the Cold War, we obviously have geopolitical competition between the West and the Soviet Union, but we have very little economic interdependence. And so even though we're at each other's throats, we have a sense of economic security. We're not worried in the US that the Soviet Union is going to sanction us, for instance. When the Cold War ends, we no longer have geopolitical competition to speak of. The US starts viewing China and Russia more as potential friends than adversaries. In fact, we invest a lot of time, energy, political capital, financial capital to try to bring them in to the international economic system. So without economic interdependence, without geopolitical competition, we feel free to embrace economic interdependence without losing our sense of economic security. You know, because why not buy all of our cheap inputs from China? We're not worried about them cutting us off. If you're China, why not invest all of your export earnings in treasuries and US assets? You're not worried about us cutting them off. What we have today is we still have economic interdependence, but geopolitical competition has obviously come back with a vengeance. And so we've lost our sense
Yep.
of economic security. True in the United States, true in China. That's what's driving their efforts to indigenize basically all of their economy. It's true in Europe. It's true in Japan. It's true everywhere. And so to your point, Sachin, they're really two ways out of this dilemma. If your belief is that it's politically untenable to lack economic security, which I think it is, one way is to get rid of the geopolitical competition, right? To link arms with Xi Jinping and Putin and to say we're friends now, we're cool. And by the way, I think that this actually might be Trump's instinct, which is maybe it's okay for us to have some dependence on China if we can divide up the world. I think the likelier direction of travel, though, is that economic interdependence is what gives way. That
Hmm.
you have significantly less economic interdependence between the US and its geopolitical adversaries over a 5, 10, 20-year time horizon. And that's how we reclaim our sense of economic security. And then the question then, if you assume that, which I do, you assume that there is some level of geoeconomic fragmentation that will occur. And so then the question is, how broad is it and how deep is it? And I think that's really what's going to play out in the next decade or so.
Hmm. Fascinating. The next set of questions that I have all really concern how the U.S. is doing economic statecraft right now from an institutional perspective. There are a lot of different agencies out there that have authorities over this area. Some of it feels kind of balkanized and dysfunctional at times. I'm wondering what reforms you would have, what are top of mind for you in making this system work better. And as a follow-on to that, I'd be curious to have you reflect a bit on the costs and benefits of how we do economic statecraft right now. And just to make that a bit more tangible, I worked at CFIUS before coming to graduate school. And the mission of CFIUS is really quite important. The idea is that we're trying to stop foreign investments from coming into the country that could compromise national security, that could lead to technology transfer, etc. At the same time, though, there are many CFIUS reviews happening that are involving companies and transactions that really don't have a lot of national security significance. It imposes a lot of costs and can be inefficient. And really, I'm asking you to speak to the trickiness of getting that balance right and protecting national security while not imposing too much of a burden on commerce.
Man, that's a big question. On institutional capacity, the way we conduct economic statecraft, it's based on institutions, some of which were built during the Cold War and others that were built really at the beginning of the War on Terror. So if you look at our sanctions apparatus, you mentioned Stuart Levy, who was the first head of it. His title was Undersecretary of the Treasury for Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. And that's, by the way, that's the office that oversees U.S. sanctions policy. Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. It sort of betrays its origins, right? It was really created to track and combat terrorist financing, not to wage economic warfare against China and Russia. You also have sort of a interagency process that is very disaggregated. You've got Treasury that has certain authorities, you have state that has authorities, you have commerce, you have USTR. I think the optimal solution would be to create a government agency that sort of oversees all U.S. economic security policy, everything from coercive statecraft to trying to shore up our vulnerabilities, supply chain investments, et cetera. I think if you can't do that, if that's too much breaking glass, I think at the very least strengthening our interagency coordination through some sort of an economic war council, economic statecraft council, I think would be the appropriate step. At the same time, just to get to your latter question about the costs, and you sort of touched on this earlier, when the U.S. weaponizes the choke point, it creates an incentive to hedge against American financial dominance, against American economic power, against American technological power. And that's not good for the United States. It's bad for U.S. companies, but also it's bad for U.S. leverage going into the future. And for a decade now, it's been actually since 2016 when Treasury Secretary Jack Lew gave this landmark speech warning about the overuse of sanctions. Everyone from Lew to Mnuchin to Donald Trump himself have said we need to start using sanctions less. And yet we've seen an exponential rise. And I think it's because, by virtue of U.S. law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which used to be quite wonky, but now everyone knows because, Trump tried to use this law to justify tariffs and the Supreme Court said he couldn't do it. That law does effectively provide the president with unlimited authority to impose sanctions and export restrictions. So I think that in order to ensure that sanctions aren't misused, we should have broader sanctions-free zones created by Congress. We already have a few, food, medicine, medical devices, informational materials. None of those can be sanctioned unilaterally by the president. You need Congress to do so. We actually saw an example of this with TikTok. When Trump tried to unilaterally ban TikTok in his first term, it was considered an informational material, and so he couldn't do it. And it did require an act of Congress to actually enact that ban. The rest of the story is a bit odd, but that's what it required. I think you should have similar sanctions-free zones, at the very least, around our treaty allies. The idea that the president unilaterally could threaten a trade embargo on Spain or threaten sanctions on Denmark unless they sell him Greenland, that is the type of economic threat that's not only stupid, frankly, but it does have long-term deleterious effects for American economic power. Because, of course, the Chinese and Russians, they're not going to depend on the dollar ever again. And who would blame them, right? But if you get the Europeans and the Japanese and the Indians and the Brazilians and effectively all these other countries having the same fear that Xi Jinping and Putin have, that they might be targeted by U.S. sanctions. If the Canadians are worried that they're selling their oil and gas to the United States and they don't have pipelines to the coast, then you've got a real problem on your hands. And I do not think that the president should have unlimited authority to weaponize American power against our allies.
Well put. Well, Eddie, thanks so much for coming on the show. And to our audience, we'll catch you next time. And I highly recommend that you buy Eddie's book, Chokepoints. It's thought-provoking and very well written. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Fun conversation.
Thanks for listening to Toast and Topics. If If you like what you heard, please rate, review, and follow us on the podcasting platform of your choice, and try sharing it with a friend or family member to see what they think. We'll catch you next time.